Welcome to session 2B, which is PATH Fiscal Compliance.
Hi, everyone. I'm Michelle. I'm here today to talk to you about PATH Fiscal Compliance. And before I get started, I'm just kind of curious, how many of you were in the last session?
So yes, if you want to use the chat, and then also if for those who just joined, if you don't mind coming on camera, this is a very small group and we'd love to have you. If you can't, that's okay, but we did want to offer that for you.
Okay, so it looks as if most of you were in the last session. So bear with me. Some of the information we're going to go over at the beginning is meant for this as a recorded production to have information that can be used independently of the PATH 101. I will be giving some additional details that I did not go into great detail with in the PATH 101. So you might get a few extra things that you didn't from before. Sound good? So our goals today are understanding the PATH purpose, goals, limitations, and required activities. We're going to go over the required elements for PATH funding and understand the fiscal expectations for reporting outcomes and use of data, and know the steps to be taken in advance of a site visit. When people are introduced to PATH, they need to understand that there are a lot of things about PATH that make it very different in how it works from other grant programs. This program for PATH is Projects for Assistance in Transition from Homelessness, and it was authorized by the Stuart B. Kinney Homeless Assistance Amendments Act of 1990 and was re-ratified in the 21st Century Cures Act. The big thing about PATH, as far as the grant type, is that it is a formula grant. So what does that mean? It is distributed annually to all 50 states and the District of Columbia, Puerto Rico, U.S. Virgin Islands, Guam, American Samoa, and the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands. And these formula grants are awarded based on statistical criteria for specific types of work. The authorizing legislation and regulations define that criteria and the amount of funds that are to be distributed. And the term formula refers to the way the grant funding is allocated. And obviously, these are non-competitive grants. And just so you know, for just statistical, this year, the PATH grant nationwide is $64,635,000 that is being split up between these territories that I've mentioned. The PATH purpose and goal is to focus on eliminating and reducing homelessness for people that are experiencing serious mental illness or co-occurring serious mental illness and substance use disorder who are also experiencing homelessness or at imminent risk of becoming homeless. This is a very, very interesting way to try to discuss this, but when we talk about what is serious mental illness, this isn't just your general, hey, I have depression, hey, I have anxiety. We're looking at the access to world. We're looking at people with schizophrenia, bipolar, serious depression, serious anxiety. And depending on your state, there may be other things that are included in that definition. PTSD is an example where you need to look at your state's definition to see if that is something that your state is interpreting from the information in the DSM-5 as being meeting criteria for serious mental illness. When we talk about experiencing homelessness or at risk of becoming homeless, PATH has a little bit different perspective on this than some other grant programs with which you may work. When we talk about those that are experiencing or at imminent risk of becoming homeless, this is going to include people who are on Section 8 funding, people who are receiving SSVF housing, people that basically under any funding stream that is providing their housing, that if that funding stream disappeared, they would become homeless and be experiencing homelessness. So understand that our definition is a little broader than that used by some other people. PATH is used, and again, this is coming from a legislative standpoint, to provide a certain menu of services that we're going to go over in a couple of slides to provide as much possible assistance to those in our target population to live the life to the best of their abilities. We're going up Maslow's hierarchy here. We're trying to get people to the point of doing the best with what they have available. We're meeting them where they are, and we're trying to make them the most functioning and achieving with the limitations they have in place. This is the only federally funded program providing outreach engagement specifically targeted to those experiencing serious mental illness. So PATH is very vital in any community. When we talked about the eligibility, again, we have people that are suffering from SMI with substance use disorder. Please understand that the substance use disorder cannot be the primary. Someone that is enrolled in PATH must have a primary diagnosis of an SMI, not otherwise. This is very similar to those programs. Like, I used to be a caseworker at the county assistance office in Pennsylvania. You could not have a substance use disorder as your primary diagnosis, except for one very specialized program that was only a 9-month program. So SMI must be the primary. And again, when we talk about experiencing homelessness or imminent risk, I believe Tony is going to be throwing in the chat in an upcoming slide an actual documentation from 2018 that spells out all the ifs, ands, and buts of at risk of homelessness. So a lot of your veterans affairs, your supportive housing, permanent housing for those who are recently experiencing homelessness, things of that nature will fall under that. Oh, we have a hand raised.
Yeah, go ahead, Angie.
So just, it's just a quick question. I don't foresee this happening anytime soon, but we have been experiencing a lot of those individuals or families who are becoming homeless or admitted, yeah, you know what I mean, risk of homelessness that do not have an SMI or SMPI or a substance use disorder. Do you see in the future for PATH outreach to allow us to work with those with this experience of homelessness, whether it's an individual or a family, due to high rent increases or the way the world is these days?
Short answer is no, and here's why. PATH is specifically meant for individuals that are 18 and older that meet the eligibility criteria. So while you might have a father, and bear with me, I'm going to explore all the aspects of that question. While you might have a father or a mother that are experiencing serious mental illness and then are now experiencing imminent risk of homelessness, that person can qualify. And if what they get from PATH benefits the rest of the family, that's great. But only the person that is experiencing the SMI would be enrolled in the program. It's not a family program, if that makes sense. As far as, do I see PATH taking on those that are literally just experiencing homelessness in the future? I do not. And I'm going to give you my little analogy that I gave in the first presentation today, just to kind of paint that picture out. Again, if you have that mason jar and you fill it up with rocks, that's what HUD would pay for. HUD is the huge amount of funding for those experiencing homelessness. Those are what your COCs get the funding for. If you pour the sand in on top of that and you fill in all those little space and cracks and crevices, that's what PATH does. And PATH funding is this much compared to the big amount that HUD funding provides. So with PATH being this much funding, it was specifically made for the target audience of those experiencing SMI or co-occurring SMI and SUD. So I don't see SAMHSA changing its mind on who the target population is in the future. I could potentially see a change, as we've seen with the COVID circumstances, in what HUD is pushing for their programming to help cover those individuals. And that is not unique to your state. We're seeing a lot of that where people, because of the end of the moratoriums on evictions and just because of the rent increases, that people in individual and family situations are becoming homeless more and more than they ever had before. And with the pandemic, there have been some sources that have noted a distinct increase with the anxieties, and basically COVID has brought to the surface underlying mental health issues that weren't necessarily present or visible before. So I expect to see some potential changing coming up, but I don't see PATH changing because it is that niched field that's
Right.
specifically for that audience.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Did that answer all the parts of your question?
And then Susan added to the chat, would think high anxiety would be present at risk of being homeless would certainly impact one's mental health.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. So as we mentioned, oh, hold it. We have another question here. Yay. I love this question. Mandy, I'm going to make sure that this is in agreement with you. The way Pennsylvania did it, and I'll throw this out as from my personal experience. The question is, if an individual is scheduled for an intake mental health assessment to determine a diagnosis, could you enroll them prior to having that diagnosis, is my understanding of the question. In Pennsylvania, if we suspected a serious mental illness, because there are things that you can look at and suspect, you know, with behavior. If you look at the SSI, SSDI, Outreach Access Recovery, or SOAR Blue Book, there from the American Psychological Association, there are descriptions of different conditions. Say, if you're working with someone and they're bipolar, it would have typical actions displayed by that person and different parameters, which would count them as having a serious mental disorder of bipolar. You can observe some of these behaviors, but in Pennsylvania, we would say if it's probable that if you have a suspicion as to, yes, they do, you can enroll them. And if after the assessment, they've been determined not to have a serious mental illness, you would then exit them from PATH and put them into a different program that could help them. Mandy, what is your perspective on that as the SPC?
Yeah, we would never want that to be a barrier from serving this highly vulnerable population. And we do have one provider who is on the call today who is not a community mental health center. So there may be some increased coordination to get that diagnosis documentation. And again, we don't want that to be the reason someone is not served. So yes, everything you said, we are in agreement with.
And Angie has a follow-up question. Could you still enter them into PATH services then if not diagnosed with an SMI? Now, let me answer this two ways. If you can enroll them into PATH until you get a diagnosis. And if it isn't an SMI, then you would have to exit them and connect them to a different program. So yes, you can enroll them without having it verified first, but no, they can't stay enrolled in PATH if they don't have a serious mental illness. Does that clarify? Okay.
And as you said, there should be some indication that that is there, right? So we're not just enrolling everybody that comes through and hoping for the best. There should be some reasoning as to why you're making that determination.
And Sharetta, I see another question. Could you explain a little bit what you mean by if they get SSI, SSDI, can you enroll them based on the client response?
Yes, ma'am. So I know at our agency, sometimes we have, we struggle with getting like the actual diagnosis. So if you know someone is getting SSDI or SSI because they have a mental health or substance issue, can we use that documentation to enroll them still in the program? Or will we need the actual diagnosis?
That's another trick question, Sharetta. Here's why.
Okay.
I know I'm that if and but kid at the front of the room. Bear with me on this one. So just because you have SSI or SSDI, one doesn't guarantee that it's a mental health condition, and it doesn't guarantee that it is a serious mental illness versus a mental illness combined with a physical disability. So just because it's an SSI, SSDI benefit being received isn't necessarily enough to make the case. But again, if you think that you're observing behaviors or getting other notes from providers in the past, or the person self-identifies, because let's face it, most people don't self-identify as having a serious mental illness if they don't. That's not, you know, with the stigma that's out there, that's not something that generally happens. If they self-identify, you can enter them into PATH, but as far as in Pennsylvania, we always required that, you know, within 90 days or whenever is reasonable with the availability of practitioners, we get a diagnosis. Mandy, how do you view that?
Yes, I would agree with everything you just said. I have nothing to add.
Okay.
So even if they identify or they've informed us that they've identified that they have that issue, we still want to make sure that we get the diagnosis or some sort of supporting documentation from another agency or provider that's working with them that can say that they do have this issue.
Yes, and here's why. Because you, when the federal government comes and does a site visit for the state, they're going to want to know that you are using the dollars as intended. So part of the legislation, you use it as what you're allowed to, and their criteria is SMI. So if you can make a case for SMI with the self-identification, you should still, let me back up. Self-identification is not enough, but I mean, if that person, you enroll them and then you send out that release of information and you're able to get records from different mental health facilities that include the diagnosis, or say that they're treating for XYZ condition, or they're on an X medication because of XYZ condition, that is solidifying the suspicions. Mandy, would you agree with that?
Correct. And I feel like just from a case management perspective, having that information could help you, you know, with their treatment plan or their housing plan or whatever you're working on with them as well. So I think it's important to have, even outside just like check the box, discussion.
Excellent. And so when we're talking about these allowable services, we get them enrolled. And again, enrollment means you meet the criteria and you agree to enroll. That these are the list of things that, according to legislation, we're allowed to do. Keep in mind that the focus of PATH is on case management and street outreach, and this is identified in the funding opportunity announcement. Also know that not every program is going to do every single thing that is allowed to happen. Programs will specifically be chosen or be asked to provide X, Y, or Z service because it meets the need in that particular community, which might not be what is needed in a different community based on the other resources in the area. Legislatively, there are things that come with special rules, and a lot of the things you're seeing on this list are something that falls under what we call the 20% max housing rule. In other words, all these things have an exchange of funds for the individual or on behalf of the individual. So when you're doing the minor renovations, and by the way, minor renovations in the PATH world is, say, putting up a railing on the front door steps so that it meets Section 8 compliance, which then could get that person housed. It's not, hey, I need a new sparkly kitchen set. No, it's those simple things. And it's not to go over 20% of the federal amount of PATH funds, because there are federal funds and there are match funds, as we'll talk about in the near future in this presentation. But any of the things listed here that you use and you exchange money on behalf of the client can only be a maximum of the federal funds of 20%. One of the big things, and you don't have that in your state, but security deposits are and one-time rental payments to prevent eviction are a big issue in a lot of states, but with the amount of funding for your state, that's not something that's a big issue for yours. As I mentioned, this is called the 20% housing max. And there was a subcommittee on the State PATH Contact Network, which is a national organization that gets together from the state level and brings up information from the providers and brings that to the group of state PATH contacts so they can integrate on a peer level to come up with solutions that are brought to the table. One of the things they did is a lot of SPCs were saying, hey, I really need some documentation. I need to know what counts, what doesn't count. And so a subcommittee was made and actual physical documentation was put together, and that is also available, and it will be coming up in the chat here too. So if you have any questions, let us know. But that's still relating to that list that we had on the previous page. So some other rules for PATH, and sometimes these get a little tricky because PATH is written as a grant in a very malleable form because it's this much funding, but it's much more malleable than some of the other sources without as many rules. But some of the rules that are definitely static to PATH are, we're not brick and mortar. We're not building anything permanent. We are not paying emergency shelters. We are not doing anything with inpatient. We are strictly outpatient. And we do not make cash payments to an enrolled person. Just because we know Bob's really short on money doesn't mean that we can give him that $20 so that he can pay for his phone bill. That's not allowed through PATH. If that person, though, is working at a drop-in center, you can pay them a salary to work at a drop-in center, which I don't think your programs have that right now, but just to differentiate, it's different giving a person a cash outlay versus an actual paying for work, which is different. And finally, as far as leases and things of that nature, you can't go beyond the funding period. One other thing I just want to bring up as far as funding and from the fiscal perspective for PATH, PATH is written and it says that if you expend if you identify the funds as being given to one entity, technically there are 2 years for those funds to be used. So what I mean by that is Mandy gets the money this year and she allocates that to a provider this year. So that provider goes through the year, but they have some money that they weren't able to use because they were down 2 out of their 3 staff for 6 months out of the year. Well, that's going to make a big difference. And PATH understands that these things happen, especially with the turnover in this field. So they've set it up so that if the funds are allocated, that those funds can carry over one more one more reporting period so that they can be used. And I'm not sure, Mandy, we haven't really talked about carryover in your state or if there is any, but just as an FYI, that's how that would work. And I think in Pennsylvania, Susan put a note in that New Hampshire has not seen an increase in PATH funding since 1990, and all this funding goes to outreach PATH workers, she thinks, and would be great to assess to more funds in order to help with that 20% area. Oh, absolutely. I totally agree. And that's where a lot of the case that we make in the PATH 101 presentation for proper documentation, so that when SAMHSA takes our data and presents it to Congress, that we're making that case for, hey, you haven't given us additional funds in a while, really like that to happen. And can we look into that? So that's where our data comes to hopefully make a difference moving forward in that.
Did I just move the slides on you? Sorry.
You did, but I still love you.
The screen is weird today.
The next thing that we have for PATH is our match. And Mandy has indicated that in your state, there's both match. Match comes from 2 sources, the state and from the provider. So there are many ways that match can be met, but that's how it's done in your state. So based on that, please just know that For every $3 in federal funds that are drawn down, there's $1 that is pulled down in what we call match. Understand that as you go through the year, this must happen concurrently. You can't spend all your federal funds and then have all your match left over, or spend all your match first and then have your federal left over. You need to do these both as you go along in the 3-to-1 ratio. Also know that the bonus is you can't be required to pay more than the $1, or in this case, whatever the percentage is from the state versus your provider perspective. You can't be asked to do more than that $1 in match. That is statutorily in there. And just so you know, annual reporting comes around. As far as the fiscal folks, most of this data comes from the HMIS system, but the first 7 questions are where you guys might get questioned on, hey, I need some information here. So those 7 questions are going to be things like, how much were you given to federally funded PATH funds for your organization? How much match was there given to your organization? And how much money from whatever source was added to the PATH funding specifically for that year? Meaning there were funds earmarked specifically for those experiencing homelessness or at imminent risk of homelessness that are also experiencing SMI or co-occurring SMI and SUD for the PATH program. And we can, does that make sense? It needs to be specifically for PATH and added to whatever Mandy's giving you from this federal and state funding, matched with your match. The other things that you might be questioned on coming with the year-end reporting is how many FTEs do we have? Typically, this will be found in the intended use plans, but if this changed during the year, you might be asked, hey, do we have a change in number of staff or how much money we gave per staff person? So we'll be looking for the FTEs as well. As far as the application process, this is where the numbers come in. So depending on how your organizations work, each year the application process is mandated by legislation. We do have each provider turn in an intended use plan, which says, hey, this is how we intend to use our money. And part of that intended use plan is a budget narrative and a budget table. Know that even with the biennial process that has been put in place back in 2019, where there's a full 1 year and a mini application the next year, that no matter what, you're still going to have to do a budget narrative and a budget table for each year when it comes time for the application and the intended use plans. As far as turnaround time, just be aware that literally from the day this drops to your SPC, that there are only 8 total weeks for all the information to be gathered and turned around and turned back into SAMHSA for the application. So if it's a little rushed, that's just because despite being a formula grant and everything else, it's still an 8-week turnaround. This has caused some issues, and I don't know how it works in your state, but in Pennsylvania, we had an internal review process where we had to take any grant application up through different levels of management up to the governor's level and have it approved. We called that the executive review process, and that process took 5 weeks itself. So literally all the stuff that Mandy had to do for, or must do for your annual application had to be done in essentially 3 weeks in Pennsylvania, so that then the final product could be sent around. So you might get frantic requests when it comes time for this. And that's why, if that is a requirement for your state as well. Any questions on the legislative background? Okay, you guys are great. I love that you've been asking questions already. So as far as PATH funding, the secretary acting through the director at the Center for Community Mental Health Services makes an allotment for each state. And again, through a formula. as we mentioned, the amount through 2022, and hopefully this might change moving forward, is $64,635,000 per year. This is determined in accordance with 290cc 24 of this title, and allotments may differ, but they range from $50,000 in the territories such as Guam up to 8.8 million, which I suspect, if I'm not mistaken, would be your Californias, et cetera. We submit this, and it's all, the amount of funding is all in approvance of section 290cc 29 of the title. Basically, there are rules to be followed once the money is given out to you. And that was a generic way of putting it, but yeah, we'll stay with that for now. So formula grants, in case you didn't know, and I suspect you do, so please forgive me if this is too basic information, but based on statistical criteria, as we mentioned, authorizing legislation and regulations define that criteria and the amount of funds. Formula is the way the funds are allocated, and formula grants are non-competitive. So as we mentioned, PATH grants are distributed to the 50 states and the 6 territories each year. That number doesn't change per year, but as I said, this is coming up in 2022. This is our last year, so I'm kind of curious what will happen next year. Please don't ask me for this formula. This formula does exist, and if you're really, really into that, I do have it on paper and I can share it with you. I just don't think that's a fun way to spend your time, but if you'd like it, I can share it with you. But there is a giant formula that is used to determine who gets what. Minimum allotment, as we talked about, is 300,000, and you said yours is 350,000 or 300,000, Mandy? 300. Okay. We do have to follow 45 CFR Part 75 Subpart D. These are the financial management standards. Are you guys familiar with those from other grant programs? I'm getting a no. Okay. The simple way to explain this is SAMHSA has guidelines set up that any grant program must follow. Like, you must have so many, like when we get to the annual report, or site visits, you're going to be wanting to look at certain reports to make sure that, if you spent more than 750,000 in federal funds, you have to do this report, et cetera. So this CFR Part 75 Subpart D talks about those different parameters that are put in place for that program. So as far as the match, we talked about this. There's a 3-to-1 match on the funding. This match, as you're already experiencing, can be in kind or cash. It must be fairly evaluated. It includes plant equipment and services. You cannot use federal funds to make the match. So if you happen to have extra ESG funds, you can't use those funds to make your part of the match. You must use local funds for that. Bear with me, folks. I'm reporting out a lot of this. I am not a fiscal person, so I'm trying to make sure that it's accurate for you. So you can have state funds too. So if you have state general funds, for instance, you could use those for match, but a lot of times those are earmarked for other programs. But basically, if you have some private funds coming in, you have donations, you have in-kinds. Do any of your program use in-kind for their participant? Oh, yes. Okay. Excellent. Do you have any questions on the in-kind? I see that Sharetta answered that. Or do you feel pretty confident with that?
One benefit of having multiple different funding streams, so like the COC funding or ESG funding, because in kind, we go over many times. So there's been a few trainings on it, but.
Excellent. Well, then I won't belabor the fact here. Wonderful. Thank you, Mandy. So this was probably covered in that training too, with the space, equipment, supplies, and volunteers. Oh, okay, Sharetta. Mandy, she's asking for some more details. On that training, did they go into a lot more than?
Well, not everybody on the call has those other funds, just some of them. So I do think it's worth going into the details.
Okay. So we have the space or plant, as they call it, and this can be the equipment or the space in the building, but it needs to be accurate value. So, you know, if you're using 5% of a space in a building, you can't charge, or you can't say that you're giving it 10% of the value of that monthly rent toward the program. You could only use exactly what's being used for that space. It needs to be, you know what, Susan? Susan just asked a question if gas mileage counts toward that agency reimbursement. I don't know the answer to that one. Let me get back to you on that. So you're saying to use the reimbursement, and instead of it going to, you're eating the reimbursement essentially, and that's your in kind. Is that what you're trying to say? Susan, do you mind?
Not quite sure how to answer that. I know that our agency pays for our mileage at a certain rate. I don't know if the state helps us with that. I don't know where they get that money. So it's not from PATH though. That's what I was thinking. PATH doesn't pay that. So maybe I'm wondering if they consider that in kind. I'm asking, I don't know.
Mandy, I don't know that one off the top of my head. Do you have?
We've never seen anybody submit mileage for in-kind, but you should be getting the mileage at the federal rate for that out of PATH. Maybe we can connect offline.
That might be your best on that. That one I can't. I need to research that and get back to you on anything I can find. So as far as equipment and supplies, and actually, well, equipment and supplies, again, everything's at fair market value at the time of the donation. So as we saw with COVID, you know, a ream of paper might cost one amount pre-COVID, and right now it might cost something very different. We just need to be able to substantiate, you know, have receipts or something that says, this is why we're saying it's worth X amount of money. As far as volunteers, it needs to be consistent with established rates paid for similar work by the state or your subrecipient. I know in other grants that I've worked on, for instance, FEMA, they have a maximum because in their opinions, you know, say a CCP grant for emergency response to a crisis counseling need, that the crisis counselors could only make X number of dollars. But is that logical for your area? For instance, in Pennsylvania, we had information that our crisis counseling program couldn't pay more than $17 an hour or something like that. But in Philadelphia, the fair market value is different. So you need to evaluate what is considered fair market for your area. And I see that Susan has her hand up.
Yeah, donations this year, we've had a real helpful donations from United Way, tents, sleeping bags, tarps, socks, in bulk. I mean, really, they've helped me out a tremendous amount. Can I count that?
I wouldn't see, well, help me out with that one, Mandy, because they didn't pay for it. Can they count it?
So in terms of our COC grants, that we are able to count that. So
okay, good question. I like this group. And I like that United Way is donating your socks and all these other items, because that's pretty cool. Is there, by the way, is there a way that you're acquiring those source or those supplies, or did they just identify you?
I ask. We have a really active COC, and United Way has been really helpful in supplying. And now I have a couple churches donating. So I think the more we get out there, the more they realize the need, and other citizens want to help. So I need to keep better track of what we're getting donated, I guess. Thanks.
Sure.
So Mandy, I have a
that's
quick
good.
question to follow up with that.
Okay.
So Mandy, with the sock drive that I do every year, is that something I can put towards my PATH that I'm donating to all those other PATH agencies throughout the state of New Hampshire like I did this year?
You should be able to. Let me just verify now with all the questions coming up, now I'm second guessing my information. So let me verify and send it out to you. Again, I'm not fiscal. I just want to confirm with fiscal that
Right.
we can do that.
Right. No, I just want to know because this is as you know, the third year that I've done that sock donation drive. And this year was a huge one for not only for my agency, but to be able to help so many within the state of New Hampshire.
Yeah.
As you know.
Well, and so in terms of your COC grants, do you use in kind for your COC, or are you using cash?
I'd have to check with Suzanne.
Okay.
I don't remember.
Okay. Excellent. This is great conversation, guys. Thanks. Okay. So as far as the matching funds, they have the same restrictions and eligibility requirements as the PATH funds themselves. So they must follow the same usage rules, meaning if it was allocated in this period, it must be used by 2 years at the end of that period, if it was right at the beginning of the allocation. And whatever you do, please maintain your supporting documentation for what you're donating and how you came to that decision. Because if nothing else, on our SAMHSA site visit to Pennsylvania, we learned that SAMHSA really wants to have everything numerically charted, referenced, and receipts and everything of that nature. So if you can provide documentation of why you're valuing that pair of socks at X rate for your in-kind donation, that's what SAMHSA is going to want to see if they come for a visit. We mentioned this earlier. The state can't require you to match more than the minimum, and they're also kicking in a little bit here. So don't think you have anything to worry about in your state. And why do you care about match? Because it's a requirement of the grant, and it's just like everything else. Each grant comes with its own strings that are attached. And for PATH, if you don't do the match, they're going to say you're not running the program properly and possibly take away your funding altogether. Charitable choice. Is anyone using a religious organization in their programming in New Hampshire? No. All right. Then if it's okay, this isn't going to apply to any of you. Basically, if you have any questions, we can reach out to your GPO, but since it doesn't affect anyone personally in this group, we'll move on from that one and give more time to some other topics. As you know, there used to be this thing called maintenance of effort. Does that sound familiar to anyone? Yes. Anyhow, the good news is maintenance of effort for PATH ended. Well, let me put it this way. They suspended it in 2017. So there was a requirement. And when we talk about maintenance of effort, it was basically saying that you're putting in the same amount, if not more, to funding expenditure levels for your services and that you're providing. Now, as I said, as of 2017, we're not doing that anymore. But just so you know, in case you didn't, that's not something that's on the table at this point. That was really why I included it in this presentation. So as far as successful programs for PATH, one of the things that you want to keep in mind, you make sure you're spending things on allowable activities and you're documenting them. We collect the data through the HMIS system and report through the PDX system or PATH Data Exchange. As I said, you've talked about your roles in those two things. As we said, there's a full application every 2 years and abbreviated applications every other year. Mandy, this year is going to be full in the spring?
The full application, yes.
Okay, so you might get a few more questions on that one just because it's the full-blown application. But as I said, each year, unfortunately, you guys, as the finance folks, you're going to still have to probably help out with the budget table and the budget narratives. We apply for these funds annually. And so those are some basics of the PATH program. So moving right along, we're going to go into the compliance aspect and legislative considerations for the fiscal and programmatic staff. As we mentioned, we have an award period that is 12 months, and that's where we call the period of obligation. So you obligate the funds to someone within that period, but the expenditure period is 24 months. So it includes that first 12 months plus another 12 months after that if it's allocated. And the liquidation of these funds gives you 3 extra months on the end just in case. So I don't see that typically happening. And especially if your whole state is receiving 300,000, you probably won't have much difficulty unless you have really open staff positions for that to come into play. Does that sound accurate, Mandy?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay. And obviously you guys all get copies of the notice of award, correct? Or how's that distributed in your state?
So everybody has a contract through us. We don't send out the notice of award. It's been the same year
Okay,
after year since 1990. So, I mean, we could send it out if people are interested, but there's no change to it.
okay. And sometimes I say the notice of award just because it might have fiscal angles that we as programmatic folks might not interpret the same way, but it might be beneficial. Just a thought. So when we're looking at the budget category for housing, and again, your state doesn't do housing, so I'm just going to go over this very briefly. There are salary costs and there are indirect costs. And the reason I go over this is, for instance, in Pennsylvania, when we had our site visit, we had to identify on our income and expenditure reports to the state each year, we had to break down the categories because what PATH considered housing did not necessarily concur with what the state's interpretation of the word housing was. And this is a recurring theme for PATH. So if you have any reports that do come in, there are 2 types of costs, with the other direct and the salary costs factoring into housing. But as of this point, that shouldn't be an issue for your folks. When we talk about other compliance requirements, you can't exclude people who have co-occurring mental illness and substance use disorders. And I find this to be a really odd thing because it's an inclusion factor. I'm not quite sure, but it's a rule. It's something that's in there. It says if you have serious mental illness, you can't be excluded because you also have a concurring substance use disorder. When we have the maximum 4% spent on the administrative cost, that is at the state level. So when we collect all the amounts spent on administration from all the providers, that's what we look at to determine statewide, do we match or reduce the 4% spent on administration? Mandy, do you have any special instructions on administration in your state? Okay.
As far as I'm aware.
Okay. And as we said, the maximum 20% on housing, which isn't affecting you. And when people want to know about the administrative costs being no more than 4%, this is where you can find the details on that. I'm not going to bore you by going back through and reading it, but that's one of those things that came up earlier when you're like, what's in that stuff? That's one of the things that's spelled out. As far as fiscal monitoring, this comes into the 20% max housing rule, but again, that's not something that you need to worry about. PATH annual reporting, as we mentioned, you are the first page of the annual report. That's where the amount of funds you received each year, the matching funds from state, local, and other sources to support PATH specifically throughout the year. And then the total funds, and this is how it's phrased, total funds dedicated this year agency-wide to persons who have SMI and are experiencing homelessness or at risk of homelessness. So this one, just for clarification, includes PATH, matching, and non-PATH funds, whereas the match question is specifically applying it to the PATH funds. Does that make sense? Then we're going to want to look at, as we said, the number of staff supported by PATH funds. And if you ever have something and you're reading through materials from PATH and it says PATH funded individuals, just know that if $1 of their salary is paid by PATH, that's PATH funded. So even if 99% of their work is not PATH, but their 1% is paid by PATH, they're PATH funded. And that can come into play in weird situations. I know it is very specific when people are entering data into HMIS. So just in case it comes up on your end for the fiscal, that's what that means. And obviously we're going to be looking for the full-time equivalents or FTEs of staff. So as we mentioned, we're going to have to do that annual reporting and with the, application process. So we're going to look at the state budget. We're going to verify the amount sent to the providers. You're probably going to have to verify that 4% max on administrative costs and understanding of the FFR SS 425 completion and 45 CFR Part 75. So let's ask about that. Are you all familiar with that report that you have to turn in within 90 days of the end of the reporting period called the FFR SF 425? Yes, no? It's sort of when at the end of any grant period, typically you have to turn in a report saying this is how much we spent of this grant fund. So that's what the FFR SF 425 is. When you, for instance, when I was doing supplemental emergency response grants, this was something that was due within 90 days of the end of the grant period. It gives you that 30 or 90 days to come up and finalize all your facts and figures and say, this is how much was drawn down, this is how much we were given, and turn that in to SAMHSA. CFR 45 Part 75, are any of your people doing drug and alcohol treatment?
We do in our agency, not through PATH.
Okay, so just because it's your agency and it's not done through PATH, we wouldn't have to really address that. But this particular piece of legislation is addressing specifically the drug and alcohol aspect. Oh, okay, sorry. It's been a while since I put this together. So as far as the SF 425, PATH is subject to that. And you need to do this within 90 days after each 12-month period. And, oh, there we go. I didn't realize that, Mandy. It says that it's now noted in the updated notice of award. So I don't know what changed. That's probably all the stuff beneath where SBCs typically are focusing because we focus on the top part. But it captures the cumulative obligations and expenditures, as I mentioned, and it's possible that you can have more than one FFR to submit depending on how long an allotment is open. Does that make sense to everyone? Okay. You guys are like, I could teach you this. So all federal awards need to comply with the, sorry, oh, you're pasting it. Okay. You threw me there, Mandy. I'm looking in the chat going, what?
Distracting. I was trying to put it in the chat so it wouldn't be distracting.
Okay.
But just to, I guess now that I've distracted everybody, to go back to that donation question, yes, that is eligible. So it has to be that it would have been an eligible expense under the grant if you were to pay for it through the grant. So it can be a third party, and I put in the chat the requirements of it.
And it's very good that you pointed out, as long as it would have been something the grant funds themselves could have paid for.
Right. Right.
And that's the key to that. Excellent. Thank you, Mandy. The C 45 CFR Part 75. This is the little catch-all. It's saying that uniform administrative requirements with the cost principles. You need to do your post-federal award requirements, address the cost principles, and make sure that you're meeting those audits. So again, like if you're spending more than, your agency spends more than $750,000 a year in federal funding, you have to do certain types of audits. We just need to make sure that those are completed. this is really basic on the financial management side, but it comes from CFR 75302. You need to make sure that each grant or award is tracked separately. I'm not sure why you wouldn't, but just so you know, you have to track it separately. As with our federal and non-federal, we have to make sure each of those are tracked individually. Again, SAMHSA wants to know that when they come and do a site visit, that you're doing that 3-to-1 as you go through. In kind, as we just discussed, should be in the system. And the recommendation is that they're both as revenues and expenses, so that you can get credit for it counting as you're using it after you acquire it. This seems pretty basic, but I mean, your program year, the budget category, the budget line item that you're associating it with from your individual intended use plans, and you need to differentiate between direct and indirect or administrative costs. And if you have some questions on the compliance with that, it's under the subpart E for cost principles. Do you guys have a lot of fun reading all this legislation and all these little detailed financial things? Do they all make sense, or do they override each other? How does that work in the finance world?
Well, I think unfortunately some of our finance people are not here too. So these are our wonderful PATH outreach providers. So that may be a more detailed response from our fiscal folks who are not here.
All right. So just let me do a quick thing. All right, we're good to go. So as far as internal controls, each state needs to establish a system to maintain internal controls, that they're managing the federal funds properly. This is spelled out in a notice of award, and you need to be using those controls as they're in compliance with the guidelines for the standards of internal control in the federal government. Again, we're back to, we need to document, we need appropriately. I'm giving you yet another resource that you can reference if you have questions. So as far as the PATH financial reporting requirements, here are some links for that. And when I kept talking about the audits, the annual expenditures of $750,000 or more can be found in Part 75, Subpart F. And as far as the financial reporting, you can look at the grant closeout at samhsa.hhs.gov if you have some more questions on that. As far as site visits, when I did site visits, I tried to make sure that I gave everything up front. It was complete transparency. I told everyone what I could possibly be looking from them from a financial standpoint and programmatic. And so with that, I made sure that when these came around, which they typically are done each year and conducted for each provider within the state. And as far as SAMHSA coming, when I say a SAMHSA or federal site visit, in all honesty, these are infrequent, and there's debate out there on how often these are done. I've seen some states go 10 years without having a federal site visit. I've seen other states get them more frequently. Not sure what the calculation method is on that. I know from the Pennsylvania standpoint, we usually had about 7 years in between our federal site visits. But then again, we were also one of the most populous as far as number of providers and people. So I'm not sure if that factored in as well. I haven't been able to get a straight answer on that. So just know that each year your state is going to come out and talk to you. Again, it's a litmus test, but for you, it's just making sure that from the finance part that, hey, you have your stuff in order, you have everything separated, you're following the maximum rules. And as far as the federal site visit, I will let you know too that for the federal site visit, the federal GPO, Government Project Officer, will choose based on the application and sometimes including the results from the annual report, they will choose which places they want to go to look at closer. So for instance, in Pennsylvania, we had SAMHSA say, I want to go to Philadelphia because they have this one agency that has 10 people listed as 10 full-time FTEs. So they wanted to go and make sure that literally 100%, since they were 100% PATH funded, of their time was going toward PATH services. So that's the type of thing that you might see. But then again, they're also going to want to see that breakdown, and you don't have to worry about the 20% max, which was an issue in our state, but they're going to want to see the 3-to-1 and things of that nature. It's not hard. If you're doing all the mechanics throughout the year, you're set. Why do we care about monitoring? We're making sure we're matching legislation and the funding opportunity requirements so that we can keep getting money. Your state has requirements to monitor your grants as well, in addition to the federal government. We're going to look at the intended use plans, and if we need to update based on the information given to us by a lead in the agency, we need to update the intended use plans as well. So if you have any major changes, just know that you're probably going to be asked for updates to any of the budgetary items going forward, and that includes line items in the detailed budgets. As far as why, we just want to make sure what's going on. As I said before, it's a litmus test. What's working, what's not working, what do we need to look into getting you help with? What do you need to possibly teach everyone else because you're doing it so well? As far as those fiscal requirements, this is how I broke it down for Pennsylvania. We had counties and joinders being multiple counties. So these are the things I'd ask for. I'd want to see their contract with the provider, because we had typically, the state gave money to the county, who then distributed, had contracts with individual providers, but we did have a couple counties that did the services themselves. But we'd ask for the current contract, fiscal reports, fiscal monitoring, invoices, if you're doing that as a reimbursement type schedule, and the most recent fiscal monitoring report, as well as your A133 audits. If it's an individual provider, we'd ask the provider any contracts and agreements, your current A133, or an independent audit of the provider's organization, and the schedule of expenditures to support the most recent payment from the subgrantee. All that makes sense? In other words, I tried to give a list of everything that we'd want moving forward. As far as the match, we need to report any income generated during the reporting period. I don't think most of you are going to have income per se. You might have extensive donations. That would be the only way that you might end up having any income. Typically, PATH is not. PATH is going to, even if they do have any money, they're going to turn around and spend it, especially with the maximum for your particular state being the 300,000. So just know, if you do have a bizarre circumstance, this whole fourth bullet point where you need prior approval from SAMHSA, if this is different, but you've been using your matching funds, but if you have a circumstance, we can always check. All right, so you guys are mostly programmatic, so I'm not sure how many more questions, but did anything spur questions in your mind? The general idea of this was to give you an idea of what we need to keep track of, what types of monitoring we need to keep in place. And oh, I see Susan connecting. Oh, no, okay. But
She'd gotten disconnected, I think.
okay.
Press the wrong button.
Okay. So we just wanted to give you a background of how PATH runs. And again, this was from a fiscal perspective, because let's face it, fiscal folks aren't necessarily as involved in the programmatic aspect. So they don't understand the basic goals and what we're trying to get to and achieve with PATH. So that was why we included the first section, so they understood, you know, legislatively, this is what we can do and can't do. Then tried to apply it to different activities that we have moving forward, and also address specific reporting requirements that just because we're a SAMHSA grant, you have to do. And in the third section, we went over, compliance and what we need to make sure is in place. By your state not doing a lot of housing eliminates a lot of the fiscal burden. So some of this information isn't as applicable just because you don't have to worry about that, which is good. But if you have any additional questions afterwards that come up, please let me know. And hopefully some of the resources that were supplied in here will make it understandable.
And I do
Mandy,
think
we have
one area that makes it a little bit difficult is, PATH is a joint grant between the Bureau of Housing Supports and the Bureau of Behavioral Health. So for most of you, you submit invoices to the Bureau of Behavioral Health, and then Tri-County, you submit to us. So know that we're working on that relationship. It really should be streamlined into one, and we're aware of that. This is just historically, this is where PATH has lived and how it's gone. So it's why it makes it a little bit difficult to nail down some of these answers, because I have to check in with the Bureau of Behavioral Health too to make sure we have a united front. But again, we're working on that. So I promise it is in the works.
excellent. Your state is different on so many levels, Mandy. I love it. That's a good
Some
thing.
ways challenging in others. So
But basically this information, and again, can be used as a resource. It gives you some background, as I said, things to note and places to look in the future if there are more questions that come up. And of course, you have your SPC who's going to be diligently looking into different aspects for you that are appropriate to your state. Thank you, everyone.
All
Appreciate
right,
your
we'll see you in a
interaction.
bit.